Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar on teaching online through interactive classroom experiments. My name is Nathaniel Berger and I'm the Director of Customer Success at MobLab. With me here today is Suyan Kong, our product manager and host, and of course, Professor Robert Gazzale from the University of Toronto, who will lead today's webinar. Before we get started, I would like to make a few practical announcements. First of all, today's webinar is being recorded and we will share the link with you after the webinar is over. Second, in the interest of efficiency, we have asked Bob to hold off on taking questions until the end of the webinar. We ask that if you do have a question, please use Zoom's chat feature to send a message to the MobLab host, which would either be me or Suyan. We are very thrilled to have Professor Gazzale lead today's webinar. Bob is an associate professor teaching stream in the University of Toronto's Department of Economics. Currently on sabbatical, he is spending part of his leave as a visiting economist at MobLab. Bob has been running classroom experiments since 2004. He has been a MobLab user since 2014 and has taught over 5,500 students in his career for various class sizes, from small seminars to large lectures with more than 800 students. We are very thrilled to have you all today joining us for this fun interactive activity. To give you a little background, we have participants from more than 10 countries and 5 different continents. With that said, I will pass the mic to our host, Professor Robert Gazzale.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Just a brief clarification. That's over 5,500 students that I have taught with using experiments with MobLab. Anyway, so let's go on to our presentation. All right, and before getting started, I want to give a brief overview of what we're going to do today. Right? So the first part, we're going to run an actual online classroom experiment with you, the participants, as the students. Right? And so in your welcoming email, you should have received a username and password. So I'm going to ask you, if you have not done so already, please access MobLab. Right? If you're a mobile user who's already downloaded the app, you can just open up the app. If you are a laptop or computer user, you can open any browser and go to game.moblab.com. Right? The username is in the welcome email. The password is not super secure because everyone has the same password of moblab123. Right? And so my thinking here is, right, by having you participate in an economics experiment as a student, right, one, you will come to appreciate the student perspective of participating in an online experiment. Right? The second reason why I decided to do this is because this way, right, we'll have a common framework to discuss, right, running of economics experiments in an online classroom. Because after we participate in the experiment, right, what I'll then do is highlight some best practices referring back to the experiment that you had just participated in. Right? After the best practices, we'll then have a Q&A period. Right? And as Nathaniel said, if you have questions at any point, please just send the questions to MobLab host using Zoom's chat feature. All right, now, the first part of any experiment, any classroom experiment, is going to be student instructions. Right? So let's start with the student instructions for the experiment we're about to run.
In this game, you operate a fishing boat on a lake. The number of fish in this lake starts at capacity. You and a number of other boats fish this lake. Each season, each of you chooses how many fish to catch without knowing how many fish the other boats are catching that season. At the end of each season, the remaining fish double in numbers up to a maximum of the lake's capacity. So, if at the end of a season 30 fish remain in an 80-fish lake, then there will be 60 fish at the start of the next season. On the other hand, if 50 remain in an 80-fish lake, then there will be 80 fish at the beginning of next season. At the end of the final fishing season, the remaining fish double in number up to the lake's capacity, and the doubled fish are evenly split among the fishers. Your payoff for the game is equal to the number of fish you catch plus your share of the end of game fish. At the bottom of your game screen, we see the current season and the total number of seasons. This player is in the first out of 5 seasons with the same other fishers. If your screen only has one number here, then you do not know the total number of seasons. Up at top, we have the total number of boats on the lake. The next number is the number of fish that were in the lake at the start of the current season. Remember that at the start of season 1, the number of fish starts at the lake's capacity. The final number at the top of the screen is the number of fish that you have caught so far this season. I guess at this point I should teach you how to fish. To drop your nets, click on the boat. This will add to the number of fish that you have caught this season. Keep clicking the boat until you reach the number of fish you want to catch this season. The season ends once everyone has stopped fishing. To stop fishing, either stop clicking the boat or click the anchor. For reasons I would rather not get into, you must have at least one click each season, whether it is clicking the boat to fish or the anchor to stop, or some combination of both. Okay, now that I have taught you how to fish, which is definitely better than me just giving you fish, let's do an example of how payoffs are calculated. Suppose there are 4 fishers on a lake where the number of fish will never exceed 80 fish. Coming into the final season, you had caught 85 fish. In this final season, you catch 25 fish. At the end of this final season, there are 30 fish remaining in the lake. Your total payoff is equal to the number of fish you catch plus your share of the final fish population. You caught a total of 85 plus 25 equals 110 fish. The 30 fish in the lake at the end of the game double to 60 fish. Splitting this evenly among the 4 fishers means your share of this final population is 15 fish, giving you a total payoff of 110 plus 15 equals 125. Happy playing! Are there any questions?
Great. Right. So the only thing that I will add, right, is in the game that you're going to play in a moment, right, there will be 5 fishing seasons, right? You will be in a group with 3 other fishers, so there's 4 fishers per group, right? And the lake's capacity will be 160 fish. Right. So what I would like to do now is make sure that you're all on board with the instructions that we just did. And so I'm going to give you a brief little instruction comprehension quiz, which does count towards your final grade. Right? So what I'm going to ask you to do is please switch to your MobLab, right? Whether it is the app in your phone or tablet, or whether it is the browser. I'm now going to switch over and start the instruction comprehension survey. Okay, great. Let's see how you guys did. I'm going to pull up the results from the survey. Okay. And let's turn to the first question. Right, the first question asked, right, assume that the lake starts at its capacity of 160 fish. Right? And during the fishing season, the group catches a total of 60 fish in the period. And the question is, how many fish will there be at the beginning of the next period? Right? And we can see, right, from the distribution of responses that there's a little bit of confusion on this question. Right? And this one is the trick question, right? And the difficulty lies in the fact that the lake starts at its maximum capacity of 160, right? 60 fish are caught, right? Meaning that there are, at the end of the season, 100 fish. Now fish double, so you might be thinking 200, but they double up to the lake's capacity, right? Meaning that, in this case, the lake's capacity is binding, meaning that there are 160 fish at the beginning of the next period, which is highlighted there. So 50% of you got it right, and now the rest of you are like, yes, double up to the capacity of the lake. Right? For the next question, right, similarly, we start out at the lake's capacity of 160 fish at the beginning of the period. This time, the group catches a total of 100 fish in the period, and the question is, how many fish will there be at the beginning of the next period? Right? This one is a little bit more straightforward. We start at 160 fish. 100 fish are caught. End of season, we have 60 fish. These 60 fish double up to 120. Right? And 75% of you, 3/4 of this, answered that correctly, right? And so here, remember, right, at the end of the season, fish double up to the maximum of the lake's capacity. Great, so now that we're all on board with the instructions for the game, right, let's play, right? Once again, there will be 4 people in each group, right? And within each, there will be 5 fishing periods, right? You stay with the same group for all 5 fishing periods. Lake's capacity is 160 fish. Let's fish. Okay, great. Let's see how that went, right? I'm going to look at the results for that first game. Here, open up the results, right? And in the results screen, I get to choose which groups I want to see. I'm just going to choose the first 10 groups. Think, 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 think. One more, 10 groups. And let's see what happened. Well, the first thing to notice is we're looking at the beginning of round fish stock across all 5 rounds. Right? And if we think about this game, right, we have a tragedy of the commons, and we looked at the tragedy of commons briefly in our last lecture, right? We have here a common pool resource. The fish are non-excludable. We can't stop any of the boats from fishing, right? But fish in the lake are rival in that if you catch a fish, that's a fish that one of the other players can't catch. Right? Now, we can think about what sustainability would look like in this context, and importantly, if in each round, right, the players in the group catch a total of 80 fish, right, this can go on literally forever. Right? And we see that there are a couple of groups that found the sustainable outcome where each round, at the beginning of each round, it started back out at lake's capacity. Right? But for the majority of groups, right, we have the tragedy of the commons. We have overfishing, right? And we see for fully half of the groups, right, by the end of round 4, right, there were no more fish at all, right? So as predicted, right, when we have a common pool resource, right, we have, in this case, the tragedy of the commons. We have the overuse of this common pool resource, right? In last lecture, we also briefly alluded to the fact, right, that communication might help in mitigating this tragedy of the commons problem. Right? So let's see, right, whether communication can help alleviate the tragedy of the commons problem. And what I'm going to do is we're going to play the exact same game, but with 2 differences. The first difference is you're going to be in a different group of 4 fishers. Right? So you're going to be playing against different people. And the big difference is this time we're going to allow chat. This time your game screen is going to have a chat function, and you can send whatever messages you want to the other fishers in your group. Right? So with that being said, right, let's see how this works. I'm going to go to the game with chat, and I'm going to run the game. Happy fishing. Okay, that that was fun. I let most of the groups go to round 4, round 5, but in the interest of time, I did stop the groups a little bit early. Let's see how things went when we allowed communication. Right? So I'm going to call up the results. As before, I'm just going to look at the results for the first 10 groups. Think, think, think. 10 groups. Generate graph. All right, and here we have the same graph as before, beginning of round fish stock. Right? And we can see that allowing communication for some groups, we still have the tragedy of the commons. And in fact, one group fished the entire lake dry after one season, and by the second season, no more fish. So great example of the tragedy of the commons. However, we see other groups were able to do a lot better in sustaining the fish stock. In fact, it looks as though, right, in round 4, approximately half of the groups were still pretty close to the lake's capacity, suggesting an improvement in this problem of the tragedy of the commons. Right? And so as we discussed in lecture last time, communication might help alleviate the tragedy of the commons, and we see some evidence of that. Awesome. Right? Now what I'd like us to do, right, is I'd like us to think about, right, why it is the case, right, that having communication, right, might actually lead to more sustainable fishing. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose a reflection question. It's going to appear in your MobLab app or in the browser. Right? And what this question asks is, why is it the case, right, why do you think it is the case that allowing communication might lead to players making different decisions? Right? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to compose an answer. Okay, great. So we have a couple of more items of business to take care of. Right? The first item of business is that we said that webinar participants, we were going to randomly choose one webinar participant, and MobLab is going to donate $100 to the charity that the MobLab participant chose. Right? So we need to randomly choose a MobLab participant, right? And I can call open the scoreboard. In the MobLab scoreboard, I can randomly choose one person, and in this case, I chose user 81. And so if you are user 81, right, we're going to look and see who your charity of choice is, and we're going to send a $100 donation to that charity. Excellent. The next thing that we can do is we can look at who might have done particularly well in this game. Right? And we see here the payoffs for all the players are listed, right? And we see that there was one player whose payoff was 429. Let's see who that person was. Ooh, user number 7. So user number 7 scored more points during this session, right, than any other user. Let's hear it for user number 7. Excellent. Okay, that being said, let's now return to being webinar participants, right, as opposed to players in an online game. Right? And so I'm going to start just very briefly. Why should you use classroom games, markets, or experiments? Right? And the big reason is that there is an accumulation of evidence, right, that having your students participate, right, in classroom games, right, classroom markets and classroom experiments actually leads to improved learning outcomes. Right? And this has been shown in a number of studies, including a number of well-controlled experiments. Right? And in reflecting why this might be the case, I think there's two important avenues why participation, right, might improve learning outcomes. Right? And the first is just the value of experiencing the economic environment. Right, and importantly, in economics, right, there's some economic environment, right, and then there are players, there are actors in this economic environment making decisions. Right? And oftentimes, right, when we develop a model with our students, right, our students are like, well, why do people do this? right? And when the student has already participated in that experiment, in an experiment replicating that market, right? You as the instructor get to turn things around and say, well, you were in such a similar situation, right? What choices did you make? Why did you make the choices that you did? And so actually having students, right, make decisions subject to the constraints of a particular environment, I think is a great way to make students appreciate what's going on in a particular model. The other reason is oftentimes there's just a value in experiencing the outcome, right? And in this is going to be especially true, right, when the outcome, right, might be a little bit unexpected. And I know from experience, one outcome that is often unexpected is the perfectly competitive market finding that price, right, that equates supply and demand, right? We present the model, we show the supply and demand, and then we wave our hands and say, somehow magically, the market finds the price at which the quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. Right? But when I have my students participate in an experiment replicating a perfectly competitive market, they get to see for themselves, right, that in an environment which is roughly a perfectly competitive market, right, pretty much regularly, right, these students participating in a market, right, actually find this market clearing price. And I think for students, it resonates. The other reason, which I think is particularly relevant, right, now that many of us have our classes switched to online, right, is students find participating in games, markets, and experiments engaging, right? And as I said, I think this is particularly relevant now with online students, right? It's hard enough in class keeping students engaged, keeping their attention, right? It's even harder when they're at home. Right? And I have a little snarky quote, right? If they're going to be playing games while attending your Zoom lecture, right? And I put this quote there for two reasons. First, right, when they are not in the classroom, it's a lot easier for the students to not pay attention, to switch from the Zoom lecture to some other thing, like playing an online game. Right? The other thing is our students, many of them, spend their leisure time playing online games. Right? And one way to reach these students is to play games, markets, and experiments in your online economics class. Right? And so why include games, markets, and experiments? Right? One, it improves learning outcomes. Right? And the second is, I think it improves student engagement, something particularly relevant in an online environment. So when we're thinking about implementing games, markets, and experiments in an online environment, we first have to ask a big question, right? And the answer of this question is going to be dictated by, right, your particular situation. And that is, how are your students going to participate? Are they going to participate synchronously or asynchronously? Right? And what makes me laugh is when I first started talking to people at MobLab, they threw around terms like synchronously and asynchronously. And I laughed because I was like, real human beings don't really think about synchronous versus asynchronous. And now that classes have gone online, pretty much all of us have had to confront, well, is this class going to be synchronous or asynchronous? Right? And so now everyone is thinking in these terms. So when we're thinking about synchronous, right, that's going to be a situation where students are going to come together at the same time, right, and participate with and against the other students who have logged in at the same time. Right? And if you are lucky and teach a lot of students like I do at the University of Toronto, right, one way to make this happen is to have lots of different times. And so if I want to run a synchronous experiment and I have a large enough number of students, I might just say, these are 4 times which the experiment's going to run. You have to show up at one of those times, right? And it alleviates the possibility of conflicts, right? If you have a smaller class, right, this might not be feasible. You know, you can't divide 20 students into 4 groups and have perhaps a large enough group to participate. Right? The other option is async or asynchronous, right? And in that case, there's going to be a window of time at which their students can participate, and the student can show up at any time and participate. Right? And there are 3 different scenarios in which you might be able to make this work. Right? The first one is for an activity, a game, market, or experiment, right, where the student's outcome depends only on the student's choice. Right? One possibility are, you know, MobLab has a survey functionality, and so these surveys can be completed whenever the student you know, has time. Right? The other situation is there's a class of games where a student's outcome only depends on their own choices. And for example, MobLab has a game, right, where students attempt to maximize utility, right? In this case, it's an individual choice activity, right? They don't need the participation of others in order to have a valid experience. Right? There are other games, right, which are going to be one-shot games, right? And in this case, it's possible, right, to run this asynchronously, right? We could imagine, for example, a one-shot prisoner's dilemma, right? The student logs in at their leisure, chooses cooperate or defect, right? Eventually, they get matched with a second student, right? And their payouts are determined. And then in a subsequent lecture, the instructor can then review the results of the group. Right? And the final one is a situation where students play automated players. And so if, for example, they were in a market with 10 participants in total, right? The student would log in, the student would be one of the participants, and MobLab would supply 9 robot players for the student to play against. Right? I'll talk more about this at the end of my presentation. Okay, so now let's get into some best practices. And this is going to highlight a bunch of the things that we did, right, in the first part of the webinar where you were participants in the experiment. Right? And the first best practice tip I can give you is you must ensure that your students understand the rules of the game. Right? When students don't understand the rules of the game, right, they tend to make choices that are pretty darn random. Right? But we are more confident that the students are making the choice that they want to make when they understand, right, what is the environment they're going to be in and how are their payoffs determined. Right? And we have 2 options here. Right? The first option is that students review the instructions before coming to the online session. Right? And it's really easy to take the URL from MobLab instructions, post them in your LMS, and ask your students to review these instructions before the session. Right? Unfortunately, right, we know students, we were students. If you ask students to come to class having done something, a very large fraction of students will not have done that unless you give them incentives. We'll talk about that in 1 second. Option number 2, right, is to do as I did in this webinar, right, and that's to devote session time to reviewing the instructions. Right? And you know, in this case, I used MobLab video instructions, and I made sure to share the audio of those video instructions. And a little Zoom tip, Zoom does allow you not only to share screen, right, but to also share the sound emanating from any of your windows, like a YouTube or video clip that you're playing. Right? So first tip, right, review the instructions. Right? Second tip, right, consider some sort of pregame survey. Right? And one case you might want to use a pregame survey is, as we did, right, to make sure that students understand the instructions which they reviewed. Right? And this is going to be particularly relevant when you've asked students to review the instructions before class. Right? If students know that there is going to be a quiz on the instructions, they're much more likely to review and understand the instructions. Right? And so the pregame survey, the instruction comprehension survey, is a way to ensure that students do review the instructions before. Another way in which you might use the pregame survey is to try and increase student engagement. Right? And so one thing that I could have done, for example, right, before the game with communication, is I could have said, what would happen, right? What do you think will happen? What do you predict will happen if we allow players in this fishing game to communicate? Right. Similarly, when I run a competitive market and I want to simulate a demand shift, I might ask, right, in the market for oranges, what do you predict is going to happen to the price if all of a sudden there is news about the wonderful health benefits of oranges? Right? And so once students make a prediction, right, they are more engaged in the game and the outcome. Right? At this point, I want to highlight something, right? And I know a bunch of us are experimental economists and we use experiments in our research. Right? And there are certain best practices that we have when we use human subject experiments in our research. And what I'd like to highlight, and something that's taken me a while to fully be comfortable with, right, is that some best practices for economics experiment don't necessarily apply with classroom experiments. Right? In an experiment which I'm doing for my research, I try not to lead my students to a particular outcome. Right? I'm going to be a little less vigilant about that in a classroom experiment. Right? And yes, by asking students, what do I predict will happen? In some ways, I am leading them to an outcome, but I'm comfortable with that in a classroom experiment in a way that I wouldn't for a research experiment. Another great example of this is at the end of the session, the game session that you played, I identified who was the highest earner. Right? This would be a big no-no if I was running this game, this experiment for research. Something that we don't do. And initially, when I started running experiments in my classroom, I never did it. Right? But in talking to colleagues and eventually I became convinced students love it. They love knowing who is the top earner in a particular session. Right? And so this is a practice that I've adopted, which the experimental economist in me would never use for my research, but for classroom experiments, I think it's fine. Okay, so for best practice, consider the pregame survey. Right? So the previous best practices were all about what to do before running the experiment. Let's think about best practices after the experiment is done. Right? And one thing that I've seen too often is instructors, right, sort of running an experiment and then just rushing past the results and then trying to get on to more material. Right? And I think it's really important to, after the experiment's done, right, to think about what had happened. And the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to review results. Right? And what I encourage you is, right, based on your learning objectives for the experiment, right, to plan in advance. What are the one, maybe two results that you want to highlight? Right? And so in the experiment we just participated in, right, I came into it wanting to highlight two results. The first is, right, the tragedy of the commons, right? And as luck would have it, we saw, right, in the first round, you guys found, we saw a lot of overfishing. And if I was running this with students, when I run this with students, I usually do 2 rounds. And in the second round, right, pretty much all groups are overfishing almost immediately. Right? So that was result number 1. Result number 2 is I wanted to see whether communication can help solve the tragedy of the commons, right? And that was the second result that I highlighted, right? So there's lots of different ways in which you can look at the results, think about what matches your learning objectives, and focus on that. One fear that people have when running classroom experiments is like, well, what would happen, right, if the results I get don't match my prediction? If I get incongruous results, I'm going to feel like an idiot. And at least for me, I say, oh, that's awesome, right? This gives you a chance, right, to discuss with your students, right, why these incongruous results happen. right? And so perhaps your students are really social minded and perhaps they don't fall victim to the tragedy of the commons, right? In this case, turn it around to your students. You can do this in an online discussion if you're, for now that we're online, right? And turn it around and say, why do you think, right? Most groups fish more sustainably than the theory suggests. Right? And this will lead your students to thinking about, right, what is the difference between their preferences and actions, right, and what we assume in theory. So, right, results, unexpected results are a great way to ask students to reflect about what happened. Which brings me to my next best practice, right? And that is to consolidate learning, right, through reflection on student participation. And there is evidence which shows that the value of using classroom experiments crucially depends on having students reflect upon, right, their participation after the experiment, right? And so what you're going to want to think about before the experiment is how are you going to have students engage with what happened, right, after the fact, right? And so the first thing you want to think about is, well, what kind of topics do I want, what topics do I want them to think about? And I think two different ways that I've found to be successful is first just asking them to explain their choice, right? Why did you make this choice? What was going through your mind when you chose how much to fish, right? And this forces students to think about, right, perhaps history, perhaps what they anticipate others are going to do. Right. Another topic is to think about the robustness of their choice, of what happened. Right. For example, right, if both the lake capacity and the number of fishers, right, increased by a factor of 10 or 10 times larger, right, do you think this would change the choices that people would make? Right. You might ask students to think about, right, well, how could a government help solve the tragedy of the commons? How could a government encourage more sustainable fishing? Right? What I do encourage you, however, is to avoid questions where there is a correct answer. Because what we want is students to reflect, right? And you want to avoid questions where there's a correct answer. You want to avoid yes or no questions because they're just going to write yes or no, right? And you also want to avoid questions that depend on knowing what happened in their groups because, right, as we saw in this Tragedy of the Commons experiment, some groups managed to avoid the Tragedy of the Commons, some groups did not. Right? And so these are ideas about what you can ask your students to reflect on. And now the next question is how are they going to express this reflection? And the first tip that I'd like to share is I think it's crucial, right, that you ask your students to reflect on what happened as soon as possible after their participation, right? Immediate individual reflection, right, facilitates subsequent activities, right? And so something that I often do is ask students to get together in groups, right? When we were face to face, that was easy. They just talk to their neighbors, right? Now that we're online, right, you can either use Zoom breakout rooms. You can also assign groups in your LMS, right? And then ask students to think about the question which you just asked them to think about as an individual, right? So for example, I might have an individual reflection question saying, right, what do you think governments can do to encourage more sustainable fishing? And then get the students to come together in a virtual group, right, and discuss, right, what one factor would your group recommend to promote more sustainable fishing? Now, importantly, all of your students, right, have had at least some opportunity to think about this question already. And we know that there are some students who require a little bit of processing time. And importantly, when you've asked the individual this question first and then ask them again as a group, right, all of them can come to this question already having given thought, already with some ideas in their mind. right? And then something that you might want to do is, right, ask the group to come up with one factor, with one recommendation, right? And then call upon random groups or all groups to present their recommendation, right? And once again, this can be done either online in Zoom breakout rooms, or it can be done offline in your learning management system, right? So that's one, is reflection through discussion. You might also have a longer written piece, right? And one thing that I would point out is if you're going to have a longer written piece, you do have access to the data that your students have generated, right? And so you can very easily download from MobLab the anonymized session data, post it to your LMS, right? And students can use this in a more detailed written response. Okay, what last topic I'd like to talk about before opening it up to questions, right, is up until now, we've been talking about synchronous online classroom experiments. All of your students getting together online at the same time, participating against each other, right? What about asynchronous classroom experiments, right? And if we're thinking about what's available in MobLab, right, you can do this in MobLab, right, currently, right, by just checking the option for all play only robots, and all of the students will play against automated robotic players, right? Partially as a result of the expected continued reliance on online learning, MobLab is working on improving their asynchronous capabilities, and I've been working with them over the last few weeks about how to do this. So one thing that's somewhat been implemented and is going to continue to be implemented is improved robotic play, right, with some instructor choice, right? And here we've already implemented instructor choice in specifying robot play in the prisoner's dilemma, right? And something that we've worked with one instructor is the instructor students first participated in a game where the students participated against greedy Nash equilibrium players in a prisoner's dilemma. And the students quickly learn, right, to play Nash equilibrium, to defect when playing against players who are going to defect. And we then told them they were going to play against different robots, and then they, in fact, they didn't know the strategy these robots were playing, but the robots were playing a tit-for-tat strategy. And what we were able to see, right, was that the students did learn, right, when playing tit-for-tat robots, that cooperation was a good strategy, right? And so, right, this functionality is being released, and you know, is something that MobLab is working on in async. Right, the other innovation is what are called async playlists. And what an async playlist will enable instructors to do is literally set up a string of activities in a playlist, and students access this playlist at their leisure, but follow the activity structure that the instructor sets. Right? And so what this means is you can have students first start by watching the video of the instructions. The student is then brought to an instruction comprehension quiz, is then brought to a game in which they play against robotic players, and is then brought to a reflection question. Right? And so students follow this instructor specified path of activities, right, is going to be implemented in asynchronous playlists. Right? And finally, MobLab, something else that I'm working on MobLab with, is designing some curated asynchronous playlists, right, based on common learning objectives, right, whereby, right, we already specify a path of activities to support a particular learning objective in it. And what all this will mean is that the instructor just has to, you know, drag this playlist into their instructor console, and then their students, right, will have a playlist that they can access to match the instructor's learning objectives. Right. So those are the best practices and that I've identified and thought about. Right. What I'd like, and I apologize, we've gone a little bit long. What I'd like to do now is open it up to some questions and for a Q&A period. I thank you very much for bearing with me. Do we have some questions?
Yes, Bob. We're just curating some questions in a list here, and
Oh,
I'm
great.
going to present them to you roughly in the order in which they were received. So I will actually go ahead and comment on this first question here, which is what principles textbooks work well with MobLab. Again, I think this is something that you can actually take a look directly on our website. Under our game catalog, there is a section that has some textbook mappings that we've actually generated for some textbooks that are commonly used with MobLab. But Bob, do you have any comment on that question?
I'm chuckling because I am a glutton for punishment, and just in my Principles of Microeconomics course, I've changed textbooks a number of times, and didn't matter which textbook I was using, I was always able to use the MobLab experiments with. So yeah, I would say you oughtn't feel constrained in your textbook choice by wanting to use games, markets, and experiments.
Okay. Nathaniel, if you have any questions coming from your end, please feel free to highlight them as well, but I will just go ahead and continue down the list.
Yeah, I got just one that came actually in twice. So this was asked, what if you don't know, most of the times how many students will participate in your experiment, and you have groups of 4 and that number is not divisible by 4. What solutions can you implement?
Yes. So I had mentioned the robot players in terms of async play. Right? One nice feature of MobLab is that you are able to run these games without knowing how many players how many students are actually going to show up. Right? And so initially, a bunch of you were already ready to play. And when I started the game, right, MobLab randomly allocated you into groups of 4, right? And perhaps there were 2 people left over. Right? And then perhaps someone joined, and well, we've got a group of 2, now we've got a group of 3, right? And so MobLab continues to fill up groups, and I can see in the instructor console, right, how many people are in each group. And I see in the instructor console, perhaps, that at a certain point, right, there is a group with only 2 players, and no more students are showing up, right? In that case, there'll be an option there to add robots to that group. Right, so what this means is the vast majority of your students will be playing against other students, right? But there will be 1, maybe 2 groups where the students are participating in a group comprised both of students and robots, right? So the add robot functionality means that every student will be able to participate in the full game, but some students will be participating against robots. That's an awesome question. I should have mentioned that earlier.
Great. Another question about the student experience in-game. So do students get a debrief so they can do better next round? Bob, I don't know if you have any thoughts about the idea of students doing better from the debrief, but certainly, they get a results screen at the end of every game. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what students should experience, sort of between rounds and over time as they play multiple rounds.
So one thing that that you might consider doing, right, is MobLab has an option to make a particular round or whatever a practice round, right? And so, right, one thing that you can do is specify the first game as a practice game, right? And that allows students to experiment with different strategies. I tend, within a game, right, not to debrief after rounds, right, to let them look at the information provided at the end of the game and figure out what to do next. But, you know, sort of as I did in this, in the experiment we participated in earlier in the webinar, right? I did, between the no communication and communication games, right? I did, in essence, debrief the student. I highlighted, oh, wow, we saw a lot of tragedy of the commons, right? And then, you know, led them into the next game where communication was allowed, right? And so generally within a game, I don't choose to debrief, but I might in between games.
Okay, great. Nathaniel, you got a question?
Yeah, we have another question from Betsy. That's an interesting one. What methods have you used to incentivize students to make decisions that really involve opportunity costs, especially if you don't have a budget to pay them?
Yeah. Oh, that is a tough one. I mean, on one hand, you know, all sorts of choices involve opportunity costs. And for example, when a student is participating in MobLab's competitive market game, right, and they have an offer to purchase one of their, you know, an item, right, the player who is a seller, right, is facing opportunity costs because, you know, if I sell my orange to you, then I can't sell it to Sion. So there is, you know, there is opportunity cost baked in, but in terms of like really focusing on opportunity costs, that's a tough one, and that one might actually keep me up tonight. What I can say is, you know, MobLab does have the survey functionality, and I wouldn't overlook, you know, hypothetical choice surveys. I think most students take these activities fairly seriously, and if you ask them to truthfully respond, I think most of them will, even if you're not putting money on the line. Right? Another thing that you could potentially do, a little bit more difficult in an online environment, I agree, is you know, potentially to, as you know, as we showed, you can randomly choose a subset of students to actually affect their, you know, and actually pay only that subset of students. And that's something that I've done in you know, many of my classes, where I say, I'm just going to choose one or two of you to pay your actual earnings. So that's another option.
Okay, cool. Moving on, we had a question from Lisa about how do you handle performance anxiety for students? And this is happening a lot with my students, and they want to, you know, practice without it being counted. So again, I think Bob, you kind of already touched upon this, but you know, also we do in fact in the activity configurations in our games and such, we have the option to explicitly, you know, even set something as a practice activity. But Bob,
Yeah, and I, you know, and I definitely, you know, and so I would say that there are, you know, two things, right? The first is, as we discussed, right, you know, setting a game up to be practice, right, where the points don't count is one way. What I do in my own classes is experiment participation counts towards their final grade, right? But as long as a student sincerely participates, right, they earn full marks for that particular session, right? I sort of, you know, at least suggest that I might look at and see whether there are students who are not taking this seriously and are choosing random numbers. So I say, you have to be sincerely participating. Right, but I don't make their grade depend on how many points they actually earn during the experiment. And I think that can be, you know, successful at ramping down the anxiety. But at the same time, right, lots of these students spend lots of their free time, right? Literally collecting points. I mean, they're participating, they choose to play with their leisure time, computer games, which just basically it's like, oh, I'm out collecting points, right? So what I find is even when points don't matter, right, for their grade, right, if you tell them the objective is to earn as many points as possible, they will take it seriously and they will try and earn points, right? So I think, having participation, having marks only depend on sincere participation, and then, just letting their competitive instincts take over, I've found to be successful.
Good. Then Christy has a question. That might be more a question for Sion, actually. She says, I use MobLab asynchronously in my classes, and I'm excited about the consolidated playlist features. When might that be rolled out?
Yes. So the async feature is currently in development, and we expect to have it out by around the second week or the middle of May. And so as we get closer to that date, definitely look for a more formal announcement from us. But I can say for now that it's going to be happening around the middle of May. Yeah, so rolling on to the next question. Someone asked, how does MobLab work for professors or instructors? Is it free or does it cost money? And so MobLab is always free for the instructor to register for an account and to play around on our platform to explore our activities and content library. And it's only when you start to get your students enrolled in your class that payment comes into play. And so we have both student paid as well as institutional licenses. And you can find more details about that on our portal or by contacting one of our representatives, including Nathaniel, for more details on the pricing structure. But again, for instructors, it's always free of cost.
Good. Then maybe moving to the next question along those lines. It seems that MobLab prices reflect US higher education budgets. Are there any alternative pricing options for small European or other regions where education is state-funded? So as Sion said, we offer different pricing options besides the student-paid option. There's department-funded integrations, and we are happy to work with you for a solution that works for you and your department. Furthermore, we also partner with several publishers, such as Cengage, McGraw-Hill, Macmillan, and we could incorporate the license to one of these publishers as well.
And I'll just add that I've found that to be successful. So when I order my textbook, I order a version of the textbook that comes bundled with MobLab. And the students find extra fees to be more palatable when they don't see it when it's included in the price. So having MobLab Access bundled with the textbook is one way to deal with students and extra fees.
Okay, let's go on to the next question. So this question is about how many games can you play or do you play typically in a given class period?
Oh, and so in a given class period, I would never do more than one game. Across a semester, so for example, in my Principles of Microeconomics course, I think I'm about 5 games across the semester, 5, maybe 6 games across the semester. Yeah. Great.
You actually just knocked out the next question as well.
Oh, great.
It's about how many games to play across the semester, Bob. So we got another question here about how groups work. So, can you assign students to groups yourself as the instructor rather than letting MobLab do it? So as of right now, students, when they join the game, they are only able to be, randomly assigned to groups initially, or, roughly in the order in which they join the game. We are working on, or planning to work on, team-based learning options in which we can give you, the instructor, more fine-grained control over how students group up to play the games. But for now, it is going to be, roughly in the order in which the students actually just join the game. Yeah, so maybe moving on to the next question, and for the sake of time, I think maybe we could take one more question. So this one's from Peter, and it's about, what is your favorite game and why? Mine is the Pit Market. They stand up and move around to find a deal. So Bob, any thoughts on your favorite game?
It's like asking me to choose a favorite child. That's not fair. But I'm actually going to choose two games. I'm going to cheat. And I'll discuss why I'm going to cheat. My first favorite game is the Bertrand Market Experiment. And the reason why I love it is because it puts students into groups of two, and in a situation of Bertrand price competition where in each period, each chooses a price and all of the demand goes to the lowest price, and the seller with the lowest price can serve the entire market. And the reason why I love that game is it always works. Right? Without fail, pretty much every group gets to marginal cost pricing super quick, right? It's awesome. The reason why I'm hesitating about including it as my favorite game is, not every principles course is going to have Bertrand price competition. But the other game, which I really love, is called Push and Pull, and it is a framed version of A Prisoner's Dilemma. And the reason why I love it is because when students play, they almost certainly don't realize that they're playing A Prisoner's Dilemma. Right? And one thing that we potentially worry about is if you tell students that they are participating in A Prisoner's Dilemma, many of our students, even before reading the textbook, have some familiarity with the Prisoner's Dilemma and might bring preconceived notions about what to do in a prisoner's dilemma. But in this framed version, Push and Pull, right, if you wrote down the payoff matrix, you would be like, oh, look, it's a prisoner's dilemma, but the students don't realize it's a prisoner's dilemma. So I think you get, you get more authentic responses. The other great thing is perhaps you want to teach the prisoner's dilemma, but you don't want to talk about game matrices. Well, this is a version of the prisoner's dilemma that doesn't require game matrices. So that would be my other choice, my other favorite child. Great.
Good. So for the sake of time, we'll wrap it up here. If there are any more questions, feel free to either email me or Suan or your local MobLab rep. I'd like to thank you, Bob, very much for teaching us how to fish, and all of you at home, wherever you might be at, for participating today. And we hope to hear from you soon. Goodbye.
Bye now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.